Hello everyone, welcome to the next video. Today's video is going to be about wonder. The setting is, for that reason, rather fitting. It's a rather foggy, misty day, rather cold as well, but I have wrapped up warm. In my last video I talked about enchantment, and hinted at wonder in that video. Enchantment can be described as existential wonder, and I'm realising more and more that wonder for me is a concept, an experience, a phenomenon that really captures everything for me, I think. And so for that reason, I'm realising that my thesis is going to be focusing on wonder, the poetics of wonder, how Dunsany approaches wonder in his stories, and of course with Tolkien as well, since it is a hybrid study. But I'm not going to be talking about Dunsany and Tolkien as much in this video. I realise that the channel is becoming rather Dunsany heavy. So I guess we can start off by saying that what draws me to wonder, the experience, and as a kind of an intellectual subject, is that as I've been doing more reading, I've realised that humility is a moral correlate of wonder. There's something that is fundamentally other appreciating about wonder. There's a sense, not so much that yourself is dissolved, but you forget yourself. You lose yourself in a song when you wonder at a particular entity, a particular place. And one of the other things about wonder is that it's also relational. Before we go any further, I just want to give an example of what I feel like wonder is to me, or kind of like a paradigm for wonder. I was camping in the woods in 2014, and this was actually, it's not only a good example of wonder, but it's also just a poignant, it was a poignant day for me, because that was actually when I first really started to get to grips with my Sartura's world building project. I remember sitting beside the fire writing some notes, but that's beside the point. I remember at evening I went for a stroll before going to bed. The sun was going down, and I just randomly seen it. I saw a deer walk past, and I remember as the deer walked past, I put my hand out, sign of respect, and I just I realise now that is a very much kind of a strong case study for wonder. I think I was taken aback by the agency of this other creature that had entered my world, and it has this sense of mastery of its own environment. Its life world, as Wilmot describes it as, which is a book I'm currently reading and I will go on to talk about. But Wilmot describes other entities as having different life worlds. It can sound wishy-washy, but it's related. It could be related to life histories and ecological science, things like this. But I was just taken aback by the presence of the stag, this red deer stag. So a key thing about this experience as well is that it wasn't an experience of the sublime, which is something different. I believe that Wilmot and others have said, like Sophia Vassilou, for example. I'm reading her book Wonder, a Grammar currently. I'll get onto these different books later on, but sublimity is different. I think in sublimity, you are a submissive subject. There's a greater sense of disillusion. It's also quite inward-looking, quite anthropocentric as well. It's to do with mastery and knowledge and things like this, but I'll try to go on to these topics a little bit later. But suffice it to say, that experience was not an experience of the sublime, because wonder is fundamentally ambiguous. There's a sense of wanting to understand more about the object or entity or place, but you still, like with enchantment, you're still yourself. There's no sense of disillusion. It's much more about wanting to understand as opposed to be mastered or dominated, or to be or to transcend. It's much more embedded and ecological and related. I think those are the key words. So I've read most of a book in preparation for the thesis by Wilmot called Reading for Wonder, Ecology, Ethics and Enchantment. So as you can probably tell, it's quite an important book. And what I really found interesting about that is Wilmot describes wonder as a kind of an event, or a story rather, that you can choose to act upon in the aftermath. Wonder isn't this experience of totality where you're instantly changed. It's ethical in the sense that it gives you options. You can either act on wonder or not. But I believe he says that even if you don't act upon it, to want to know, for example, more about a stag, or to appreciate it in a more fuller way, even if you don't make a conscious judgment, the experience of wonder itself has brought those two pathways up. You can either it's kind of a signaling experience. You can either act upon it or not, but those contrasts in itself show you that there is knowledge to be gained. If you see what I mean, it brings you, rather like Tolkien's Recovery in a sense. It shows you that there is the possibility to learn from being engaged with, for being engaged in an experience of wonder. I hope I've described that correctly. So just to bring it back to a broader perspective, the reason I'm interested in wonder is because, again, it relates to humility, and that has implications for mastery. Mastery is something that I've always been interested in a intellectual sense, or in an emotional sense as well. One of my key interests is anthropocentrism, or non-anthropocentrism, and so I think I'm realizing that there are different connections and linkages which are very interesting for my thesis, but just in general, how wonder is connected to humility, and humility is connected to mastery. And Wilmot says that wonder is fundamentally ecological. It's fundamentally about the natural world, and that then obviously relates to people like Patrick Curry, who says that enchantment is best appreciated in nature. So I'm realising that a lot of the things that I never really had a vocabulary for, I had a vocabulary for non-anthropocentrism and ecocentrism, things like this, but the philosophy of wonder itself, it's kind of baked into it, if that makes sense. Another interesting aspect of wonder is what Michael Saylor writes about. Michael Saylor is a historian. The philosophy behind as if. That's two words in quotes there. So, for example, if I see a badger or a deer or a cat or any object at all that causes me to wonder, it's a kind of an as-if virtual reality experience, because you're given the chance to experience the life worlds of these different agencies, if that makes sense, which you can then act upon in the aftermath of the experience of wonder, when this kind of the process of wonder comes to an end. Just to link it back to what Wilmot says. And it's interesting because it has implications for fiction in general, for media in general. Michael Saylor writes about the ironic imagination, where you can be delighted but not deluded, which I believe we as readers of fiction are experienced in a kind of a social practice where we're constantly trying out different possible lives. So you can see where I'm going with this. It relates to not only fiction but also virtual worlds as well. And I found that fascinating because the experience of wonder is it just relates to so many different things. So there are all these different aspects to wonder, which I'm slowly coming to understand a little bit more, and by no means fully aware of all the different implications of wonder, especially how it relates to the sublime. That's a more of an intimidating topic for me, which I'm going to have to grasp a little bit more fully before I can really tackle it. There are different types of wonder, and I'm reading a book by Sophia Vasiliou called Wonder: A Grammar, which I feel like it's kind of muddied the waters a little bit, whereas Wilmot cleared them. Because Vasiliou talks a lot about knowledge and uses Wittgenstein's ideas of language and things like this, and it's very much outside of my area of interest in terms of what I'm going to be studying for my thesis, but I'm reading the book because I think in the most general sense I probably should know more about wonder before writing about it. But there are all these different aspects, as I say, to wonder, and there are what Wilmot describes as the poetics of wonder, eco-poetics in particular. Things like heteroglossia, which is essentially the employment of different ways of writing in order to slow the reader down. It's kind of like defamiliarization or estrangement, in that for example, different meters or different ways of describing things, making things strange, helps create that sense of wonder. So heteroglossia, different words, I guess. That's just one aspect of the poetics of wonder. There are a variety of others, but I've not written them down here. Another interesting thing about the poetics of wonder is in relation to Aristotle's Poetics, and particularly the literary form of tragedy, which kind of threw me off in a way, because I've been reading about tragedy from the perspective of eco-criticism in fantasy, and tragedy can be related to a more anthropocentric view of things, in the sense that tragedy, of course, is related to catharsis and storylines, plots that revolve around the human, as opposed to what Don Elgin, for example, and Joseph Meeker talk about as the comic ecological mode, which is connective in the sense that humans are described as being lower, but they're also seen as being more admirable because they are connected to the world, they're fallible, and that brings them down, which is not anthropocentric, of course. So I that's one of the things I'm going to be writing about, is that wonder to me is more in relation to, or can be more it can be situated within this context of the comic ecological mode. But Wilmot says that tragedy is more ecological because it can be related to wonder. And I think his point there is that in relation to Aristotle's Poetics, he says that although in classic texts it revolves around the human, there are also systems that are beyond the human, which can never be fully known, I think. And I am going outside of my comfort zone, I have to admit, but there are all these different aspects of wonder that I find interesting, and I don't know how much I'm going to be putting of those types of ideas into my thesis, but I find it interesting nonetheless. So another aspect of wonder that's rather interesting is the internal aspect of wonder in stories, particularly in fantasy stories. So of course a lot of people talk about wonder as an external experience that is invoked in the reader, but of course wonder is experienced in fantasy stories by the characters themselves. I was just reading an article about this just today before it came out, and a great example of this, of course, is when Sam and Frodo encounter the Oliphant in Ithilien, and how Sam is sort of taken aback by it. Of course, another example is Lothlorien, when Aragorn wanders spellbound through Lothlorien and Caers Galadhon. Or of course there is when Frodo and Sam see the elves walk past and at the very start of the Fellowship of the Ring, Gildor and Glorian, the company, when they go to the Woodland Hall. All these different experiences of wonder in fantasy narratives themselves are interesting because, and this is kind of my own idea, is there's a sense of reverence there. Not in a didactic sense, not in a very, like an overly moralistic tone, they nevertheless show you how to appreciate, in a sense. Just in the same way that I spoke about very early on in the early stages of my thesis in an early video. I talked about how engaging with contemplative characters can help us contemplate in real life, essentially, retain beauty, things like this. I believe that when we experience wonder in narratives, we gain that language in ourselves, if that makes sense. We can see the proper response to entities that deserve reverence. And so something that I've always been drawn towards and made emotional by is experiences of wonder in narratives, in films, in video games. And I'm thinking right now of the film The Jungle Book from 2016. I remember Mowgli and Bagheera prostrating themselves before the elephants. I remember Bagheera says, they are the lords of the jungle. And he looks down and shows reverence. That kind of feeling has always made me rather emotional. It's giving deference to things that deserve respect. I'm not quite sure how to put it into words. I think this is why I've always been drawn to fantasy, in the broadest sense. If I'm being honest, it's the sense of the wondrous, the sense of the reverential, where the world isn't purely commercial and economic and drab and mundane. Things are given their due. So I'm realising now that a lot of the things that I've done, they are expressions of wonder. They are appreciations of the expression of wonder. Tolkien memorised. When I would memorise Tolkien's poems and songs off by heart, to go out there and to record those videos is not only to honour Tolkien, but to honour nature, to honour the spoken word, to breathe wonder into the world, in a sense. Another example of this, I have to mention it because it's such a significant part of my life, is of course World of Warcraft. The experience of wonder in World of Warcraft plays out in a variety of different aspects, but one of the strongest aspects or examples is roleplay. Roleplay in World of Warcraft, roleplay in any MMORPG, or of course in real life with live action roleplay, things like this. But roleplay for me was really a way to express wonder in the most fundamental sense. In these online role-playing games, such as World of Warcraft for example, you can play the game in two different ways, two different modes really. This just applies generally for other role-playing games as well. On the one hand, you can play the game knowing that you're engaged in a game. You can complete objectives, you can finish quests, you can defeat enemies, gather treasure, things like this. All the time you are aware of the mechanics of the game, the systems of the game. You're playing it knowing that it's an experience. You're doing it almost in a kind of a... You're doing it almost for gratification to gain rewards. The other sense in which you can play these online games is to roleplay. And a lot of the time these two different modes are segregated. They're very much distinct from each other. So in World of Warcraft for example, there are servers, which are essentially just means that people that are on these servers play the game knowing that they're playing a game. Role-playing servers, on the other hand, these are dedicated more to community aspects. They're dedicated to you fabricate a persona essentially, and you become that character. So with that out of the way, a good example of this is that in the gameplay servers, you can enter a city. There will just be people that are going about their business, collecting items, opening mail, talking to each other. But very much the communication is very much based on progressing through the game. But in roleplay, it's very much a different experience. If you walk through a city in a roleplay server, there will be, it's quite a sight to behold. And this is, I no longer play World of Warcraft, but it's one of my favourite experiences of all, not only all games, but just, it's one of the most valuable experiences with media that I've ever had, in the most general sense. In roleplay cities, players behind the screen are embodying their characters. They will actually be standing and talking to each other in the language of fantasy. They will be speaking in archaic tongues. They will be role-playing as rangers, in a company of rangers, or there'll be knights. People wandering about, as I often did, as a botanist, looking at the trees in the park in the city of Stormwind. And that's where the sense of wonder comes. Because you are, it's not just it's not just playing the game as the developers might intend. And of course, this is all, again, just want to make clear, this is all applicable to other role-playing games as well, of course. You'll be familiar with it from Dungeons and Dragons, things like this. But if I was to roleplay as a night elf, with another night elf, we might walk through the forest of Teldrassil, or Ashenvale, and we would look at a tree, and we would stand by it, and we would wonder at it. We would say, "Behold the majesty of this oak. Lo, do you see, brother, the stag that wanders over yonder?" Characters are embedded in the world. You are given a chance to show, even in an online virtual world, reverence of nature, or any object, really. Things become more amplified, things become more heightened, and that's what I've always loved. I used to run various guilds, various companies in the game, in World of Warcraft. One of these was called Tree and Leaf Travel. It's a company where we would just simply go on expeditions and explore and just try and feel out the world, just wander and just learn. And some of these things, of course, I have talked about in my Ecological Citizen essay, Developing Ecocentrism Through Roleplay Within Online Virtual Worlds. I believe that's the title. But just to wrap this up, seeing it as it is getting rather cold, I wish that I had put in more of the vocabulary of wonder within that article. And that really signals then, just to bring this conversation to a close, it's an experience that signals value, but it also encapsulates everything that I value. So hopefully that was an enjoyable video. I realise there was quite a lot of different tangents and different threads of discussion, but again, it's just like the experience of wonder. It feels like talking about it provides a sense of mystery, kind of that ineffable quality that I discussed about in relation to enchantment. It feels like an inexhaustible subject, really, which for that reason I probably will be talking about it more. So thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.